Knights didn't feast on fantasy banquets. They ate practical, status-laden foods that shaped real campaigns, and the details tell a sharper story. 1. Roast beef. Roast beef didn't show up on the table by accident. A whole side of cattle had to be chosen days earlier, slaughtered in the manor's own yard, then carried into the kitchen where cooks worked with open hearths and iron spits long enough to hold the weight. The meat turned slowly for hours, basted with whatever fat collected in the drip pans beneath it, and the timing mattered because the Lord's steward needed the roast ready just as the hall filled with men gathering for the march ahead. Knights treated it as a marker of status. Fresh beef wasn't an everyday meal, and serving it before a campaign signaled the household's resources as clearly as the armor lined up near the doors. Large slices were carved first for the Lord and his leading retainers, then passed down the tables in uneven portions that reflected rank more than appetite, while carvers kept working through the joint until the last of the useful sections were gone. Whatever didn't make it onto plates that night was set aside for the next morning in thick, cold slabs that could be eaten quickly before mounting up. 2. Mutton. Mutton showed up more often than any other meat on a knight's table. It was reliable, easy to source, and didn't require the level of ceremony reserved for beef. One household record from the late 13th century lists whole flocks set aside specifically for feeding armed retainers. The cuts varied widely, but the shoulder was the workhorse piece. Cooks simmered it in large cauldrons because that softened the tougher fibers, and the broth that formed around it usually ended up as the base for whatever vegetables were on hand. Salted portions filled in the gaps when fresh carcasses ran short. Those pieces were boiled even longer, sometimes with ale to blunt the sharpness from brining, and the result fed dozens at once without much fuss. The pattern repeats across surviving accounts, no matter the region or season, and in one inventory from a small Midland estate, the only item listed under meat for war service is 3 barrels of preserved mutton fat. 3. Salted pork. Salted pork was the main meat that could be counted on to travel with a knight. Quartered carcasses were dry salted in coarse crystals, stacked in barrels, then topped up with brine to push out air and slow decay, and account rolls from great households list dozens of these casks set aside in the weeks before a host assembled. Once in the hall, the process didn't change much. Slabs were fished out, soaked to draw off some of the salt, then boiled in great pots so the fat rose and could be skimmed or saved, while the liquor left behind might be used again for pottage or to stretch a thin stew that had more grain than meat in it, even though everyone at the table knew this was campaign food being eaten on home ground. 4. Venison. Venison ended up on the high table as a signal that this was a serious occasion. Lesser meats could feed a hall, but deer said something about who had the right to kill it in the first place. A 15th century household book for a great lord notes a single autumn hunt yielding more than 30 deer, with a clerk carefully listing each carcass, the number of bucks of the season, and which ones were earmarked pro preceptor for the lord's own household before a campaign. The animals were brought in from the park, bled and opened in the field, then broken according to a set pattern, so the prime haunches and saddles could travel quickly to the castle kitchens, while the lesser cuts, heads and offal, went to retainers and servants, and that division of the animal maps almost perfectly onto the social ladder sitting beneath the rafters. On the day of a departure feast, those chosen joints reappeared in cooked form, often as great roasted pieces for the lord and his companions, and as baked venison pasties further down the boards. Spices and wine might be used on the high table dishes, both to soften meat that had been hanging for days and to show off resources that ordinary tenants would never taste in that concentration. Lower down, the same deer might only be recognizable as shreds buried in thick pastry or stirred into a dark pottage. What ties all of that together is that the animal itself came from rights most people were legally barred from using. Forest law in much of medieval England made deer beasts of the chase, reserved to those with aristocratic hunting privileges, and poaching could mean fines, mutilation, or worse, so the venison on a knight's plate came wrapped in layers of law and status before it ever reached the spit, The record of those bucks of the season ends with a note that the skins were set aside for sale, while the antlers were kept back, leaving a rack of polished bone hanging on the wall not far from the benches where the meat had been eaten. 5. Boar heads weren't always served with the carving still attached, though illustrations often show them that way. Some accounts describe whole cuts arriving at the table instead, which complicates the usual image of a single grand centerpiece, and the difference seems to come down to who hosted the feast and what they wanted to signal about their household's reach. A full head meant spectacle, a cleanly cut joint suggested access to skilled butchers, and a kitchen that could handle tougher, older animals without wasting meat. Both approaches show up in the same decades. That creates a small puzzle, because court records list far fewer boars taken in seasonal hunts than the number served during winter gatherings. So either hunting tallies underreported what was taken, or some hauls filled the gap through private purchases that never made it into the surviving paperwork. One lord in Suffolk received a complaint from his own steward about a boar too lean for the high table, which doesn't match the idea of boar as an unfailing symbol of might, especially when lean animals were usually culled for common meals rather than highlighted during celebrations. If the lean carcass still ended up on the board, the record doesn't say why. 6. Roast goose. Why did roast goose become the default bird for wealthy households once the weather turned cold? The answer sits in the bird itself. A mature goose carried a thick layer of fat, a long breastbone, and wings that browned quickly under direct heat, so cooks could predict how it would behave on the spit. Most were trussed tightly with skewers or linen to keep the shape, then set to turn over open flame while pans underneath caught the melted fat. That fat was valuable on its own, showing up later in pastry or used to baste other dishes, and the carcass held enough meat to serve several people without carving away half the bird at once. A plucked goose looked almost blocky compared to swan or peacock, which made it easier to portion cleanly at the table. Once you look past the bird itself, the pattern widens. Geese were raised in large flocks on estates with access to water and good grazing, which meant a lord could bring dozens to the hall at short notice in late autumn. Their feathers and quills added another reason to keep them, giving scribes and fletchers extra material without much extra expense. And that mix of meat and byproducts made them a practical choice for households that wanted abundance without waste. The timing mattered too. Geese fattened naturally in the months leading up to winter, so the birds reached their peak just as feasting seasons began, and sources note that households counted on that cycle as part of their planning. By the time they reached the table, the geese sat alongside heavier meats but rarely lost their place in the lineup, and nothing in the records suggests the practice ever fell out of fashion. 7. Pottage, thick stew. Pottage usually sat in the biggest pot in the kitchen, warm and ready before anything else. Knights ate it without ceremony, knowing it was the one dish guaranteed to appear whether the hall was quiet or preparing for a long ride. The base came from grains or legumes, and kitchens stretched it by adding whatever vegetables were left from earlier meals. Meat only appeared in it when scraps were too small to serve on their own. Household records show the pot rarely started from scratch. A bit of yesterday's batch stayed in the bottom and blended into the new one. No one treated that as unusual. It kept things moving when dozens of people needed food quickly. Even during large feasts, a separate kettle stayed on a side hearth for anyone not important enough to be served the main courses. After most dishes were cleared away, that pot kept simmering. 8. Bread trenchers. Trenchers. Most people assume trenchers were flimsy bread plates, but the surviving examples point the other way. They're closer to dense slabs than table bread. Some inventories describe them as 2 or 3 days old before use, which explains why they held their shape when piled with stews or meat juices. The odd part is how often they appear in elite households even when wooden plates were available. That suggests the practice stuck for reasons beyond practicality. A few kitchen accounts list trenchers baked specifically for feasts, made from lower-grade grain kept separate from the main breadstock, which means they weren't always simple leftovers. Their afterlife matters too. They were handed to servants, gathered for the poor, or tossed into animal feed, depending on the hall. One record from a northern manor notes dozens stacked near the dais at the end of a winter feast. 9. Cheese, hard and soft varieties. Cheese shows up everywhere in medieval records, yet the details rarely line up cleanly. Some lists sort it into hard and soft, others ignore texture entirely and group it by region, and a few don't describe it at all beyond the weight. What's consistent is the form. Hard wheels keep turning up in inventories because they traveled well, stayed stable for long stretches, and handled rough movement between posts without falling apart. Softer cheeses appear often enough, but the descriptions get thin. A few clerks noted them by season, which suggests they didn't last long and were eaten close to where they were made. Larger households sometimes kept both types together in cool storage, stacking the firm wheels below and wrapping the softer ones in cloth, though some entries hint that the cloth wasn't always replaced as often as it should have been, which probably changed the flavor more than anyone admitted. Taken together, the pattern points to something simple. Hard cheese moved, soft cheese stayed put. 10. Fish, freshwater pike, perch, eel. By the time knights sat down, the fish had already done a small economic tour of the region. Records from English estates show pike, perch, and eel moving through a chain of river rights, manorial fisheries, and licensed fishmongers long before it reached a great haul. Pike often came from managed ponds or controlled stretches of river, pulled out by workers under obligation, then handed over by count and weight to stewards who tracked every fish in wax tablets or on parchment. Perch tended to appear in larger, cheaper batches, sometimes bundled with small fish in accounts that don't even bother to separate species, which suggests they were filling out the menu rather than starring on it. Eel is the odd one. In many places it functioned almost like currency, paid as rent by tenants, tallied in hundreds, and then redirected either toward Lenten tables or big gatherings where meat was being held back for religious reasons. So what looks like a food choice on the plate often started as an obligation on paper. Some manorial rolls simply list, "So many eels, delivered alive." 11. Salted or pickled herring. A single barrel could pack several hundred salted herring. A clerk in Edward the Fern's household recorded huge purchases of herring at ports like Great Yarmouth and Kingston upon Hull before campaigns against Scotland in the late 1290s. The fish were cleaned, packed in layers of coarse salt, then sealed in wooden casks that could be rolled, stacked, and counted far more easily than fresh meat on the hoof. From the ports, wagons took those barrels inland to castles and mustering points, where knights gathering for campaign ate the same fish that would follow them on the road. The price per hundred stayed low compared with beef or pork, which made it attractive when a lord had to feed retainers, squires, servants, and hangers-on all at once. Another royal account from the early 14th century shows herring ordered in the same breath as arrows and cart hire, treated as part of the war kit rather than a luxury dish. How many knights associated that sharp, salty taste with going to war instead of with Lent? 12. Smoked salmon. How did smoked salmon actually get from the river to a lord's table? Household rolls from river estates show salmon coming in as rent or seasonal dues, then moving almost straight into curing. The fish was split, heavily salted, and hung in small smokehouses built near the water, where a low, steady fire from hardwood or peat did the work over many hours rather than a quick blast. Records mention sides and harlots of salmon, which suggests long, flat pieces suspended on rods so smoke could move evenly around them, with servants rotating batches as space freed up and new fish arrived from the weirs. Only houses with reliable salmon runs could manage this on any scale, so nobles with good river rights ended up with something that was both practical, preserved fish that kept for weeks, and a quiet way of showing off that access. Finished pieces were counted, tied in bundles, and set aside with other reserved foods, waiting for the next fast day when meat was banned but status still had to be displayed. 13. Eggs. A steward in a northern manor notes, "Eggs for pies, 3 dozen, all broken," and barely bothers to mention any boiled ones at all. That tiny line hints that whole eggs on a plate were rarer than the simple recipe makes them sound. In many household accounts, eggs appear as numbers crossed out and replaced, moved from for the household into columns for pastry or special dishes for guests, as if they kept getting reassigned upwards. The same books give precise counts for hens and geese in the yard, yet the recorded egg totals look suspiciously low for the flocks listed. A few muster rolls and campaign letters mention eggs being bought or seized on the march, usually alongside onions and bread, but they still show up most often for pies, not as separate portions for ordinary men. It's unclear how many were eaten straight away and how many ended up folded into something richer. Some church accounts even list eggs as offerings at Easter that then reappear, weeks later, back in the kitchen tallies for baked dishes. So the basic food from the yard keeps slipping through the paperwork and landing again and again in pastry for those at the high table. The accounts just keep repeating that same note. For pies, 14. Meat pies, beef, venison or rabbit. People tend to picture neat little hand pies, one per person like a takeaway in pastry. That's not how most medieval meat pies worked. Accounts mention whole pies being carved on the table and scraped empty, with the thick crust treated almost like packaging. Servants got the soggy shell, while the good filling went to whoever mattered. In household records and city ordinances, meat pies sit in an odd space between meal and container. Bakers in some towns were fined for skimping on spices, even though those spices mainly masked age and helped the filling last on the road. So you get this strange mix of food safety, flavor, and status wrapped into one object. Marching men were given slices from great communal pies or carried dense wedges that could be reheated or just eaten cold, and there are notes of travelers paying for a place at a fire specifically so a pie could be warmed. A few inventories even list empty pie shells stacked in the kitchen, ready to be filled and sealed again, which raises the question of how many times the same pastry was used before anyone thought to throw it away. 15. Spiced chicken or capon. Spiced chicken and capon were luxury statements first, dinner second. They signaled a household that could afford ginger by the pound and saffron by the ounce, and that mattered more than whether every mouthful actually tasted of them. On paper, these dishes marked a table as properly wealthy. In practice, the flavor often lagged behind the image. The business behind that image ran through merchants, port cities, and household clerks. Ginger came in from long-distance trade, packed in bundles and booked carefully in the steward's roll, while saffron was weighed out in tiny amounts and kept locked with silver and plate. A great house might order spices on credit ahead of major feast days, then spend months paying down those debts in rents, wool, or cash. Once tenants had finally settled what they owed, so every pinch that went into a pot had already moved through a chain of bargains. Kitchen staff didn't control that. They were handed a measured packet and told which bird it was for. Recipe collections talk boldly about generous spoonfuls of spice, yet household listings for the same events show much smaller quantities being bought. Some birds were basted in broth touched with ginger, while the capon at the Lord's place on the board got the real thing. It leaves a simple question hanging. How many people in the hall actually tasted the saffron they'd been told was there? 16. Legumes, peas, beans, lentils. Kitchen notes make a fuss over something tiny. The peas had to be washed twice. Accounts from 14th century English manors and Parisian townhouses mention dried peas and beans bought by the sack, then soaked overnight before boiling. Specifically so, they'd burst and cloud the pot. That's how you get the thick, gluey base that turns a thin broth into a meal, whether it was straight pea mash on fast days or a ladle of legumes stirred through pottage with barley and scraps of greens. Once they were softened, the work was mostly mechanical. Cooks beat them against the side of the cauldron, pushed them through cloth or a coarse sieve, and salted the paste hard so it kept its shape in the bowl. Lentils appear less often in northern records, but when they do, they're treated much the same way, just needing less time on the fire. Color even shows up in a few recipe collections. Yellow peas preferred for the table, green ones more common in the everyday pot. Some kitchens cooked the legumes separately, then added a scoop to each person's serving, rather than thickening the whole cauldron at once, which meant yesterday's mash could be cut into slices and fried again the next morning. 17. Turnips, and parsnips. So, where did turnips and parsnips actually sit on the medieval table? They showed up everywhere, pulled from strips of open field land, yanked out of cottage gardens, and carted into town markets by the sack, then roasted whole in embers or chopped into the same broad cauldrons that handled pottage and meat. Parsnips tended to get the better reputation, especially in regions with lighter soils, because they grow longer and sweeter and could stand in for more expensive ingredients in Lenten dishes when meat and dairy were off limits, while turnips were often talked about as something closer to animal feed that people happened to eat as well. Both crops stored well in earth clamps through winter, which meant they could appear on peasant tables as a main dish, roasted with a bit of fat or stewed with herbs and a few scraps of bacon, and on wealthier tables as bulk under pricier cuts, soaking up meat juices that the poorer household would never see. Once dinner was done, anything left could be sliced, fried in animal fat, and served again as a side the next day. 18. Cabbage or leeks. By the time the broth reached the table, the cabbage was barely there, just pale shreds drifting between chunks of barley and meat. Accounts from garrison kitchens talk about carts arriving at first light with bundles of cabbages and long leeks, counted by the dozen and noted in tight Latin on expense rolls, then handed straight over to the cooks. They stripped the outer leaves, hacked the rest into rough pieces, and threw them into the big pot late in the boil so the greens didn't disappear completely. The sequence stayed almost the same everywhere. Bones on first, grain added next, then, near the end, armfuls of chopped leaf to turn a thin meat liquor into something that looked like a meal and kept men from falling apart through winter. One complaint from a border garrison mentions much herb and little flesh, which fits the economy of it. Cabbage and leeks were cheap, grew close to the walls, and filled space in the bowl when there wasn't much else to work with. Outside the fortress, small plots behind houses carried the same plants, and leeks in particular picked up that later association with Wales, though the records rarely bother to explain why they mattered symbolically while they were being boiled daily into anonymous green strands. Some days, a serving lad could lift a wooden spoon and catch a single strip of cabbage hanging off the edge. 19. Oat or barley. Porridge was the thing that kept everything moving first thing in the morning. Grain went into the pot long before daylight, usually broken oats or hulled barley, because whole kernels took too long and burned more fuel. Water was the base in most houses, with milk added only where livestock and money allowed, so the texture and richness depended less on any recipe and more on what the household could spare on a given day. There are instructions that talk about constant stirring to stop it catching at the bottom, but it's not clear whether servants genuinely did that or whether that was the ideal version that only big kitchens could manage. Even the ratio of grain to liquid shifts from source to source, which changes everything from a spoonable sludge to something closer to a drink. The basic idea stayed the same though. Get something hot into people quickly, using grain that was cheap, filling, and sometimes slightly inferior to what would be baked into bread. Barley shows up more often in places where wheat was too valuable to boil, while oats are tied to colder, wetter regions where they grew better than almost anything else, which explains why certain areas leaned on them far more than others. Salt might be added at the pot or at the table, or not at all if the salt barrel was running low. And later recipes bolt on honey, herbs, or scraps of fat that earlier descriptions don't always mention. That mix of careful instruction and fuzzy detail is what makes it hard to pin down a single standard porridge, even for the same region and century. What doesn't seem to change is the timing. It's almost always described as something eaten early before work or marching, boiled once, ladled fast and gone. 20. Honey-glazed dishes. A roasted bird could arrive at table with its skin shining under a coat of honey. That shine mattered. It read as luxury. It tasted like access to something rare, drawn straight from hives instead of distant sugar plantations that hadn't opened up yet. And it turned an ordinary bit of poultry into proof that this household controlled both land and bees. A steward in one household inventory notes honey being reserved for sauces and basting, which suggests it wasn't poured freely, but brushed on at the end, sometimes mixed with vinegar or wine, so it would cling to the meat and darken in the heat rather than just burn. Cooks ladled it over capons and chickens at the very end of roasting, sent the dish out while it still glistened, and then watched the carved pieces vanish, with diners taking the outside slices first because that's where the honey sat in a thicker layer. In some descriptions, the leftovers from the platter were scraped up with bits of bread by servants once the high table was done. That doesn't quite match later claims that honey was a simple, everyday flavoring for everyone, especially when other records show it counted carefully in household accounts, sometimes right alongside pepper and saffron. There are passing mentions of vegetables and even porridge catching some of the same glaze in humbler kitchens, usually when a little of the roasting liquid was stretched out and used twice. But those glimpses are rare enough to raise a quiet question of their own. How many people actually tasted that honey glaze? And how many only smelled it from the back of the hall? 21. Fruit: apples, pears, plums. Most people picture medieval fruit as a rare dessert, hauled out only for feasts. In practice, orchard records from England and northern France list dozens of bushels of apples and pears gathered at harvest, far more than a single celebration could use. Account rolls sometimes name specific varieties, especially keeping apples that were meant to last months. Fresh fruit eaten straight off the tree almost never appears in those books, because no one bothered to count a child eating a pear in the yard. But the moment that same fruit was sliced, threaded onto cords, and hung in an attic to dry, it turned into a measurable asset. Dried plums show up the same way, halved, stoned, and recorded by weight as they went into barrels or jars. Those entries sit oddly next to how cheaply garden fruit is valued when it's listed fresh. In some years, a whole sack of windfall apples is written down at less than the worth of the sack itself, while a much smaller measure of dried slices carries a clear price. Across a typical year, that gap shaped how people actually used apples, pears, and plums. At harvest, when trees were heavy, fresh fruit went into hand pies, simple stews, or straight onto the table for anyone in reach, and it moved so quickly from orchard to mouth that there was little reason to note each piece. Once the weather turned and daylight shortened, the dried version took over. Rings of apple or pear softened in cooking pots, mixed into grain dishes, or simmered with ale, and pressed plum pieces reappeared in winter puddings where a handful could stand in for a much larger weight of fresh fruit. Some manorial accounts even show tenants sending dried fruit as part of their obligations when grain was short, which only works because those slices and halves could sit quietly in a dry loft for months without spoiling. 22. Dried figs or dates. By the time dried figs or dates reached a noble's table, they were closer to a financial asset than a snack. Customs rolls from ports like Southampton and Bordeaux list them alongside spices and fine cloth, grouped with high-value imports rather than food bought by weight for the kitchen. A single small barrel might arrive tagged to an Italian shipper's mark, then be sold on to a local merchant who split it again into smaller bundles for great houses inland. When those bundles appear in household accounts, they sit on the same line as saffron and pepper, bought rarely, in deliberate quantities, with clear notes about who authorized the expense. From there you can trace the path backwards. In the Mediterranean, growers left figs to dry in the sun on mats or rooftops, turning something that spoiled quickly into something that could survive weeks in a hold. Then they were packed tightly into lined baskets or stout sacks, pressed hard enough that the fruits clumped together and could be handled almost like blocks. Venetian and Genoese carriers moved them west and north, mixing them with cargoes of oil and wine, and every point along that route took a cut. Harbour dues, market tolls, the merchant's percentage, and finally, the steward's margin when he justified the purchase to his lord. That's why the same records that treat local apples as a trivial garden product can list ficus sicki and dates at prices that only the wealthiest households were expected to pay, even though the actual weight of fruit might be quite small. Inside those houses, the fruit almost never appears in casual contexts. It's counted out piece by piece for high feasts, Lent dishes, or gifts to favoured guests, and often stored under lock-like plate or coin. A clerk might note a platter of figs and dates sent up with roasted meat or fish on a particular saint's day, but leave no hint of whether anyone in the hall preferred them to the cheaper dried pears and plums already on offer. If a handful went missing from the jar between delivery and serving, there's no record of who ate them. 23. Ale was treated as food first and drink second. It sat in the same mental category as bread. Records show daily allowances that look absurd by modern standards. Several litres per person, on paper at least, for everyone from hired labourers to children in great houses. Some of that went into cooking, some into weaker small ale, and some probably never reached the people it was nominally meant for at all. The sources don't line up cleanly on strength. Recipe collections suggest fairly strong brews for feast days, while city regulations mention weaker everyday batches brewed quickly and consumed within a few days. You're left with a picture where ale covers everything from mild, almost watery mash to drink that would slow a worker down long before noon. What's clearer is how people moved around it. Servants carried covered jugs up and down stairs, topping up cups without comment. Workers in town shared measures from the same pot at set breaks. Monks logged their ale in careful Latin beside entries for candles and parchment. In some places, women brewing at home sold the surplus over a bench or from a doorway, turning a necessary chore into a side income. There's a modern habit of saying water wasn't safe, so they drank ale instead, which only fits part of what shows up. Wells in some regions were perfectly usable, rivers in crowded towns were sometimes awful, and you can see authorities trying to control both polluted streams and badly made ale at the same time. The drink ends up doing double duty, safer than some water, full of calories and socially expected enough that skipping it would have seemed odd. In the end, the everyday scene is simple and keeps appearing in different records. A wooden cup beside a trench of food and a shared jug of cloudy ale within arm's reach. 24. Mead. Many mead recipes start by telling you to skim foam. That line comes after you've mixed honey with water and brought it up to a near boil, because the first thing that rises is a thick layer of scum that brewers were told to lift away or risk a drink that turned sour or cloudy before the feast ever began. Once that's cleared, the really precise part starts. Honey to water ratios like 1:3 or 1:4. Check not with numbers but with tricks such as dropping in a fresh egg or a bit of bread crust and watching how much of it stays above the surface, which quietly sets how strong and how long the drink will keep. The sweet liquid then goes into wooden vessels while still warm, picking up yeast from the air or from the sides of barrels that have seen earlier batches, and that quiet borrow of living residue does most of the work people later credited to elaborate secrets of the cellar. Fermentation can run for days, but the better meads are left for weeks or months in cool storage, which immediately explains why this wasn't something you threw together for ordinary meals. Careful households rack the mead off the sediment into a second cask once the bubbling dies down, chasing a clear, bright drink that can sit ready for weddings, saints' days, or a rare visit from an important guest. Some instructions add a final layer with herbs, spices, or roasted crab apples tied into cloth and dropped into the cask, yet all of that hangs on the simple act of skimming that first pan of foam into a waiting bucket. 25. Spiced wine, mulled wine. Why serve hot spiced wine just as men were about to ride out? By the late 14th century, it was almost expected at noble departure feasts in both English and French households. A chaplain travelling with one Burgundian lord described servants carrying a great bowl around the hall, dipping a ladle again and again into dark, scented wine for each man at the high table. The base was usually red wine from Gascony or the Rhineland. Into that went cinnamon, ginger, cloves, maybe grains of paradise, plus honey or early cane sugar if the household could bear the cost. That meant a single cup could mix French or German wine with honey from local hives and spices brought through Venice from much further east. It was talked about as wholesome and strengthening, even if the heat and alcohol minutes before riding must have left some men slightly unsteady. There's also the timing, which is where feasting practice and battlefield practicality pull in different directions. The spiced wine usually came near the end of the meal, after meat and sweet dishes, carried out when toasts were called and last speeches made. Men were expected to stand, lift their cups, answer the ritual healths, then head for the yard to collect armor and horses with the warmth of the drink still fresh in their throats.